So, good morning. Welcome to the second day of the conference. Herzlich willkommen zum zweiten Tag unserer Konferenz. Ich werde es erstmal versuchen, ein bisschen den gestrigen Tag nicht jetzt umfassend wiederzugeben, aber zunächst mal der Einstieg gestern. Wir wollen ja die Frage der sozialen Mobilität und Aufstiegschancen im Zusammenhang mit dieser Präsentation der Studie thematisieren, mit einem Fokus auf einen Politikbereich. MyPEX hat ja, wie Sie wissen, 7 Politikbereiche. Einer der Politikbereiche, die wir auf einen zentralen, relevanten Bereich halten, Bildung. Mit diesem Fokus haben wir gestartet, dass Bildung ein wichtiger, ein zentraler Faktor sein kann für Teilhabe und Aufstiegschancen. Damit hat ja Alice Ross in seiner Rede begonnen und dabei auch die Notwendigkeit von positiven Beispielen, Role Models wie Lehrerinnen und Lehrer auch unterstrichen. Eine Idee, an der wir auch im Rahmen anderer Projekte arbeiten. Hanne Enzinger hat in seiner Keynote neben der Reflexion von MyPEX und die Frage der Indikatoren, Definition von Migrant, Integration etc. hat auch gesagt, dass Integration an sich kein linear verlaufender Prozess ist, sondern in unterschiedlichen Stufen abläuft und auch welche kontroverse Definitionen und Positionen auch zur Integration an sich selbst gibt. Und dass Bildung zwar ein wichtiger Element dabei ist, aber auch Grenzen hat, gerade wenn es darum geht, die Frage der Teilhabe und auch Partizipation umzusetzen und die Frage der Glass Ceiling, wie er das auch gesagt hat, also wo gibt es die Grenzen. Und die Podiumsdiskussion hat ja das ganz gut aufgegriffen, um zu sehen, wo gibt es dann die verbindende Identität, sozusagen eine politische Identität. Was ist das Gemeinsame, was ist das Verbindende in Richtung einer multikulturellen Gesellschaft oder Vielfaltsgesellschaft? Wie laufen die Integrationsprozesse und welche Fragen von Zuschreibungen, welche Rolle von Loyalitätskonflikte, all das wurden ja gestern thematisiert. Zuerst mal als Einstieg fand ich also so einen politischen Input ganz hilfreich. Ich hoffe, ist auch so angekommen. Thomas Huddleston hat die Studie sehr umfassend auch die Ziele von MyPEX erläutert, die auch sehr hilfreich waren, um in die Breakout-Sessions in den Arbeitsgruppen nochmal auf bestimmte Politikbereiche fokussierend, nämlich Bildung, Arbeitsmarkt und Staatsbürgerschaft, zu schauen, inwiefern sind das Handeln des Staates als richtunggebender Stakeholder, inwiefern ist das eigentlich hilfreich, um die Frage von Teilhabe, Partizipation und Integration mit all den Beschränkungen, die diese Begriffe auch haben, umzusetzen. Also die Rolle der Policy-Ebene, das ist so das Ziel von MyPEX und ich glaube, das ist gestern auch klar geworden. Heute fokussieren wir, weil wir denken, immer so von den Policy Areas auszugehen, auf 2 wichtige Elemente. Eins ist der Arbeitsmarkt, also die Partizipation am Arbeitsmarkt, die Teilhabe an der Arbeit. Das wird Georges Lemaitre mit einer Keynote erläutern. Wie ist das eigentlich die Realität und wie läuft es in Europa und in anderen Industrienationen oder Einwanderungsländern mit der Teilhabe am Arbeitsmarkt? Und ein anderer Aspekt, den wir auch hervorheben möchten, ist die politische Partizipation. Mehmet Kilic wird auch darauf intensiv eingehen. Im Anschluss gehen wir dann in die Breakout-Sessions, in die Arbeitsgruppen und werden dann 3 Politikbereiche von MyPEX bearbeiten. politische Partizipation, Antidiskriminierung und Diversity, Politik und Menschenrechte und Flüchtlingspolitik. Der letzte Politikbereich ist nicht exklusiv ein Bereich von MyPEX, aber wir haben diesen Politikbereich eingefügt, weil wir da ein Gap sehen, was für künftige Bearbeitungen gefüllt werden sollte. Am Anfang wird Thomas Huddleston an der Stelle von Jan Nissen, das haben sie untereinander so ausgemacht, wird dort, wo wir gestern einfach angefangen haben, was ist so politische Rahmenbedingungen zu schaffen und wo sind wir, wie sieht die Realität aus? Thomas hat ja auch in seiner Präsentation ja auch etwas erwähnt und da wollen wir jetzt etwas diesen roten Faden auffangen und gehen. Wo gibt es eigentlich die Kluft? Weil die beschäftigt uns ja ständig. Auf der einen Seite sagen wir, wir brauchen Rahmenbedingungen, das ist wichtig. Also Politik muss handeln, Politik muss eine aktivere Rolle einnehmen. Gleichzeitig wissen wir aber, dass es mehrere Stakeholders gibt, die daran beteiligt sind. Nicht zuletzt natürlich Migrantinnen und Migranten selbst auch. Und wie ist es, wenn man es vis-à-vis der Realität dann vergleicht? Wo sind die größte Kluft und wie kann sie gefüllt werden? Da wollen wir heute auch in dieser Richtung einstoßen. Und am Anfang bitte ich Thomas Huddleston, da weiterzumachen, wo wir gestern aufgehört haben. Thomas.
Thank you, Mekonnen. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to anyone who's just joining us today. In the, let's say, 15 minutes that I have, I'm only going to briefly go through and give some of our MPG analysis of the results and ask what is driving change across Europe. Is it action from the European level, from the Council of Europe, from the EU? Are there future possibilities to have greater European cooperation in these areas? And who else could actually fill the gaps at the national level? Could it be you? So for this, I'm going to identify, again, some of the gaps that I spoke about yesterday. Where do we see countries tending to score very weakly on the MyPEX equal treatment framework? I'm going to give you a better idea of what the European level has done to fill those gaps at the national level. I'm going to then identify the other trends that are going on, which actually don't have to do with European cooperation in legal terms, but with maybe an exchange of ideas or certain trends that we see. And then ask where the European Union, Council of Europe in the future could fill these gaps and where you actually might be able to fill these gaps by using MyPEX. So, strand by strand, on labor market we found that, as I said, while many groups might have equal access to the labor market once they have the right to work, not all groups have this right. And also we see that the targeted measures to help migrants into employment, like the recognition of their qualifications, tend to be rather weak. On family reunion and long-term residence, the gap here was often the definition of the family, whether it's only the nuclear family that can be reunited or the larger family in which immigrants and nationals live. And then also the increasing conditions that are asked for family reunion and long-term residence. Are they more than, let's say, the basics that are required in society? On education, there were many weaknesses, but in generally we talked about the targeted measures to address migrant pupils' needs, also their new opportunities in intercultural education. Those were very extensively discussed in the workshop yesterday. Political participation also generally weak, but again particularly we see that countries are very different in terms of granting voting rights or creating strong, robust consultative bodies of immigrants. Political participation, sorry, I just covered that. And access to nationality. We again see that there are trends on eligibility, but we see that it's a slow process, that there are still many high and ambiguous conditions for acquisition, which I outlined. And on anti-discrimination, we particularly found that the equality policies of states and the powers allocated to equality bodies tend to be generally weak. Now, how has the European Union and the Council of Europe tried to fill some of these gaps? Now, on the areas of long-term residence, family reunion, and labor market mobility, you can find important European Union directives. The Directive on Family Reunion, long-term residence. Also, with regard to the labor market, I would also mention the Qualification Directive, which is relevant for refugees, beneficiaries of subsidiary protection. Also, the Reception Conditions Directive, which is relevant for asylum seekers. The Free Movement Directive, which is relevant for EU citizens. So, what does this mean? Well, with these directives, we see that governments have agreed on minimum standards in these areas. Now, minimum standards means that for many countries, this already corresponded to their legislation in place. So when they transposed European law, they actually said, well, we already guarantee those basic rights. Some have therefore derided these standards as really minimum and serving little purpose. However, they do function to secure those rights. It means that in the future, governments cannot go back on those basic promises, basic securities. And if we look at some of the countries in MIPEX that don't fit under those standards, we've seen that happen. Denmark, for example, has been doing this since 2002. The United Kingdom proposed to do it with its earned citizenship package that the current government says it will no longer implement. And then in new countries of immigration, these minimum standards have been very helpful to basically start working on integration, because it requires that authorities move from a process based on discretion to one based on the rule of law. And that's why we have seen some new countries slightly improving in these areas, like on labor market, Poland, Hungary, and Latvia. And on family reunion and long-term residence, we've seen new and old countries that have to improve to meet these basics: Luxembourg, Belgium, Portugal, Spain. So it does lead to some positive improvement. And we also see that there are other new countries of immigration which have not benefited from these standards. I mentioned already Ireland, which you might see at the bottom of a couple strands. There, the government has been trying to pass a reform, as I said, for the past now 10 years. And they cannot muster enough political will to pass that reform. They would have to if they were under EU legislation. Another related area, I would say, have a look at Switzerland on the field of anti-discrimination, where obviously Switzerland, not being a member of the European Union, does not have to even establish a dedicated law against racism. So we see that there is an added value of having these secure minimum standards for both old and new countries of immigration. The problem is, of course, that these are very incremental, piece by piece. I mentioned these directives, and they take small groups from within the migrant population, but they don't actually address all third country nationals and say that all third country nationals who have the right to work should have equal access to the labor market, should have equal access to social security. So there are still certainly some gaps there. It's an incremental process. And it's also a dynamic process, because sometimes when you establish very strong EU legislation, then there's a backlash in areas where governments still maintain sovereignty. For example, if you followed these discussions on family reunion, you might be aware that EU citizens have a very strong and clear right to be joined by their spouses. And so some governments then react by saying that they need to constrain the rights of their own nationals to family reunification. And you end up having a more advantageous position if you're an EU citizen than if you are a citizen in your own member state. On education, here we don't see very many EU binding standards. Obviously, the right to education is something which exists generally in the international human rights framework. And there is an EU directive dating back to 1977 on the rights of EU citizens. But here we don't see that the EU has been doing much work to improve countries' policies. On anti-discrimination, here we don't have minimum standards, but we actually have rather binding standards from the EU level. The 2000 directives are very rigorous and really seen as landmark legislation. Before that legislation, only around 6 countries had dedicated anti-racism laws. And since then, every country has had to adopt these laws. So the way that we conceive of what is discrimination, the areas of discrimination that we are talking about, the way in which our courts have to adapt to discrimination cases is all determined by EU legislation, particularly, for example, in Germany. So I think that you can appreciate the value in Germany that European anti-discrimination law has had to inspire improvement. And many countries have gone beyond the minimums that are required in EU legislation. A few of them still adopt really a minimum approach, like Austria. Some of them are still actually infringing the directives. Some, like Germany, as I said, will transpose the legislation, but will leave equality bodies very weak, so that, in fact, it might undermine access to justice. But in general, we have seen consistent improvement in this area. And my colleague Uyen Do will speak about this in the workshop on anti-discrimination. In the last 2 areas, political participation and access to nationality, we haven't seen that much work. As I said, these are areas where if you read EU recommendations and documents, access to nationality should be part of the integration process. Granting political rights is seen as part of promoting democratic participation, and it's regularly recommended. The Council of Europe here has 2 conventions. One is particularly on the rights of foreigners to participate at local level, and on nationality, there's one on the European Convention on Nationality. Both of those conventions, though, have been signed by few European countries. On political participation, the number who are signing are fewer over time, so it's not getting a lot of interest. On political participation, the only countries that have signed are the countries that already granted these political rights. So you can't say that by signing the convention you have improved the legislation. What that has done, as I said earlier, is that it has secured those minimum rights. So if a government would, perhaps unthinkably, like to withdraw voting rights from a population, that would not be possible because it has signed these conventions. And on nationality, the European Convention there is a little less relevant for immigrant integration because it's mostly trying to set standards for the loss of nationality, but it doesn't actually set very many standards about acquiring a nationality. So here we haven't seen much work by the EU. So the question is, well, what else? Maybe perhaps the European Union and the Council of Europe are not the be-all and end-all. Perhaps we can rely on positive trends which are going on as we have a more common European discussion on integration. And we have seen some positive trends. I outlined them yesterday. For example, on access to nationality, the greater tolerance of dual nationality, the granting of birthright citizenship, a shorter residence period of between 3 to 7 years. All of this is going on without EU or Council of Europe guidance. Also on political participation, many countries are granting voting rights now or creating consultative bodies out of their own interest. These are new countries of immigration in the south, and even we see some voting rights for immigrants in Central Europe. But we also see trends which are using, let's say, the lack of EU standards to adopt new conditions which, as I outlined yesterday, might actually be obstacles rather than incentives for integration. For example, on long-term residence, I noted that already we see countries from north and south, east and west making many more conditions for long-term residence. Often what they do is they take the high requirements for citizenship and now also require it to get a permanent residence permit, which gets to this discussion of whether something like being a permanent resident is just like being a second-class citizen, that you actually have to fulfill the same requirements as to be a citizen, but you don't have the same rights as a citizen. And we've also seen with the crisis some countries undermining their policies by making policy changes, or also by withdrawing their funding for integration programs, or also for equality bodies. So the trends are a bit mixed, but there are still some trends that could be harnessed more at the European level. What could happen? Coming back to those gaps that I mentioned, I think you could see more work at the European level, also if that's an interest of yours, in some of these areas. On the targeted employment measures, on the recognition of qualifications, the so-called EU 2020 strategy and employment is aiming to work more on the integration of migrants, but the integration actors are not yet there actually in the employment field and really pushing this. In terms of granting access to all third country nationals, there are EU directives that are being proposed, like a single residence and work permit that would guarantee those clear set of rights. Or also the asylum directives are being discussed for a recast to also look at these rights. But here there are many member states who see absolutely no interest in having EU standards and in working towards greater equal treatment. So in these areas, some of these directives are pretty stalled. The same can be said on equality policies. If you look at what's going on at the European level, there is a new proposal for a horizontal directive. That really only deals with the areas like the definitions and the fields of application, but not actually with the strength of the equality policies. And here also member states are not even very interested in setting higher European standards. You might take the case of Germany, for example, where Germany's legislation at the national level looks pretty similar to what's proposed in this horizontal directive, but even so, the German government is opposing setting more EU law in this area because they ask, well, we don't think that there's much of an added value in this new European legislation. In some of these areas, then I think we'd have to ask ourselves if we want stronger European standards. On political participation, do we want to really try and revitalize the European conventions that are out there? On access to nationality, do we want a new European Council of Europe convention that actually tackles the issue of acquisition of nationality? And I think it's also time that we ask whether the European Union should have greater competence on political participation and on nationality, since they are so important for the integration process. Now, I'd like to end then by asking, let's say, how you can fill some of these gaps, because we see that MIPEX identifies gaps, but it's often up to the policymakers, the integration stakeholders, to make proposals for change. I was recently in Dublin with a new network called the European Network of Migrant Women, bringing together migrant women organizations from really all member states, and they're asking themselves whether they should do a campaign on family reunion at the EU level, because the current legislation does not really take into account the disproportionate impact that these policies have on women. And they're asking themselves some key questions. Do we want to better enforce the current standards? Do we want to raise those standards and have more secure rights, more equal rights? But you also see, let's say, opponents mobilizing on these issues. And we've seen the Dutch government, for example, lobbying in the opposite way, to argue that we need to lower these minimum standards on family reunion, because governments now want to adopt even more conditions and more reservations, and the Dutch government might not be alone in this. So on this issue, you can also go on our website. MPG has done an impact assessment of this debate, saying, where do we want to go on family reunion? Do we want states to have more opportunities to create conditions that might be obstacles? Or do we want to have more binding legislation to argue for the right to family life? Now, these are the kind of discussions that we can have on European level. I'm interested to see where it goes. For example, the European Commission used MyPEX back in 2008 when it reported to the integration ministers at Vichy. And the Commission argued that based on the MyPEX results, political participation and citizenship policies were weak across Europe, and that governments might need to reform these because actually both of these areas are key to develop a sense of belonging, democratic participation in our societies. But you might also, since many of you are working at the national level, try to fill that gap instead in your own work and not go to the European Union. And I'll give one example here of how people are using MyPEX for that purpose. In 2007, in Greece, our partner noticed that the Greek policies on citizenship also came out as pretty weak. And they corresponded to the situation that you were seeing in the press. If you were born in Greece, the child of immigrants, you had the right to stay in Greece until you were 18. And if you didn't find a university degree, if you didn't find a job, you became illegal and you could be deported from the country you were born in. So hearing the impact of these weak policies on immigrant integration, the Greek partner used MyPEX to develop a petition among civil society and academics to follow these reform trends that I mentioned earlier, so that Portugal, Sweden, Belgium, Germany could prove as inspiring cases for Greece to improve. And then in the debates that ensued, MyPEX was used to fact-check some statements made by ministers. A proposal was made to reform citizenship, and using MyPEX, the partner was able to show that if this proposal was adopted, Greece would be more like the European average on nationality, and it would not be the most liberal country in Europe. It would be no more liberal than Germany, which was very convincing, I think, in Greece to argue that they must be going down a very sensible approach. So I then ask you to think throughout the rest of the day how you can use MyPEX and the gaps it identifies in order to fill those gaps, either with your work at the national level or by pushing for greater European cooperation. Thank you.